John, while you're doing your thing, I'm just going to introduce myself really quick
Thank you. I was just going to ask for
because no
that.
one here knows me. I'm Rebecca Rotundo. I'm the Associate Coordinator of Instructional Facilities. So I'm responsible for all of our centrally scheduled classrooms, which number up in the 180-ish, and some of our student lounges. So I am the person that is always asking. I'm the problem child. I'm always like, but can we do this? But can we do this? And always trying to push and and support innovation and improvement across the university. And we help work to guide the university and help them to set standards. So hi everybody, it's nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
So
Glad you're
glad you're
here.
here.
And then Adam.
Hi, I'm Adam Pelletieri. I'm also at the University of Buffalo. I am primarily an AV systems design engineer, but I also work a lot with our facilities project teams in terms of like drawing review and coordination on new construction projects.
Awesome. And Josh.
I'm Josh Kaufman, formerly the chair of the Avixa Tech Managers Council, also formerly the operations coordinator for Tufts University, and currently the chair and president of the Grove Street Foundation for Jewish Resilience.
Awesome. And I'm John Pfeffer. I'm the chair for, or no, what is it called? The advisory board chair for FlexSpace. And so that's why we sort of put this idea together to talk about universal design, but also to talk about it somewhat through the lens of FlexSpace. Lisa, can you sort of kick us off really quickly with what FlexSpace is for those that don't know, and what HETMA's doing with, or why HETMA's involved in FlexSpace now?
Oh, yes, and it's always a challenge not to dive deep into the history, but it goes back to the SUNY system having 64 campuses and how we weren't well communicating with each other about what we were doing with classroom technology. And like we've talked about earlier, someone said, but what if we somehow or the other build a database of classrooms? And that's how it started. And then it was just a matter of other people expressing interest. We presented a few times. And the nature of the goals shifted a little bit. Like, not only can FlexSpace be a place to look at pictures and look at all of the facilities and technology in the room, it's like, how do we standardize this so it makes sense to everybody? And I think John is doing a great job thinking ahead, and I'm so glad Rebecca and Adam are here with us today too. I'm not as familiar with what Josh and Aaron are up to, but to now be looking at universal design and look at how FlexSpace can be helpful and respond to the questions that we have around universal design. Quick enough, John?
That was great. That was perfect, right? And then I'm going to kick to Aaron. I'm sorry, Aaron, I missed you on this. Did you want to introduce yourself as part of this panel? I think you're muted.
Yeah, I was trying to get out of the way here. No, I'm technically not on the panel, but I'll be happy to be as a participant here for if needed.
That's great. Awesome. And so, Josh, can you talk a little bit about what we mean by universal design? And I've thrown some talking points up here. Of course, they're not all of them.
Yes, and I appreciate you throwing those up because one of the key tenets is that you should have multiple means of representation of that information. And so just me talking at you is not ever going to fully get through your head. The basic premise of universal design is really summed up in its name, is that it is universally designed. We're trying to think about all the potential barriers that a user might encounter rather than going and saying, okay, we have a student who needs a visual accommodation or an audio accommodation or needs the lectures recorded or needs notes provided for them or whatever specific ADA accommodation they're entitled to. We're looking at that and saying, okay, what can we do to make this room already accessible? And if you're even looking at this right now and you've got, you see that little closed caption button down at the bottom of your screen, on the Zoom call and all these other little things that, everybody uses every day. Those are universal design concepts that making them accessible without that barrier for entry because, and I can speak from personal experience on this, I'm sure a lot of other people can too, that barrier for entry can be annoyingly high when you're dealing with education, and especially when you're dealing with students in higher ed, 18 years old, out on their own for the first time, right? We're talking about these kids who maybe don't have the experience advocating for themselves in the way that they need to, or don't have the diagnosis in hand, or don't have, a school that's providing them with guidance as to how to achieve those accommodations and therefore be able to succeed. I can tell you again, going to college in the early 2000s, that framework was there, but it was not, I don't quite know how to put this, not exactly advertised, put it simply. And when you did try to acquire those accommodations, you'd often find yourself running up against various roadblocks, not necessarily maliciously, but just because administratively it was an afterthought. And as we've come forward, we're starting to see that classroom design, and technology design needs to be accessible for everybody because we do have, massive numbers of students from all different ability levels, all different backgrounds, all different disabilities, visible or invisible, coming to our campuses. And at the end of the day, it's a whole lot cheaper for us to build the rooms out right and build them out accessibly than it is to try to shoehorn something in that was not meant to be in the space, or to try to build the space, or to add a one-time accommodation for a student. And so that's what speaks to these things about like equitable use, flexibility, simple intuitive operation, because we're not just thinking about the students too either, are we? And I'm sure everybody in this call knows that client calling, hey, I can't make this work. What does this menu do? First of all, we don't want them pressing random menus because, you never know what that's going to do. But second of all, you'd like them to be able to start their class quickly. And I'm not going to run through every single one of these points right now. I don't want to take away time from everybody else, but suffice it to say, we're designing it. It's designing it on two axes, right? We're designing it for the students, for accessibility, students, I should say, and anybody else in the classroom or event space, and then the faculty to be able to use that space without having to have a high knowledge base coming in, and also be able to not have to put a whole lot of effort into using it. Because if you put a lot of effort into it, they're not going to want to use it.
And I just want to add one point to underscore what Josh is saying. It's hard to empathize with students and some of the challenges they have unless you've experienced it. And I got to tell you, since my hearing went to hell in a handbasket, it's much different now. I really appreciate good acoustics in a room.
Absolutely. That's actually one of the things that I found is the easiest way when I'm dealing, not to stereotype, with older administrators, is use the hearing thing, because everybody knows their hearing's going, their eyes are going. And those are the two easiest things to convince people, because that is something that they're experiencing.
I'll take a quick question. I see Chris has his hand raised. But he's still muted. Okay, Chris, trying to answer your question there with your hand raised. So, while we're waiting for that unmuting, I'm gonna go quickly to our next slide here. And I'm gonna tee this up for Rebecca. I'm really excited about this concept that universal design does not equal ADA compliance.
Yes. I'd like to first set out and say that I am not an ADA specialist in any way, shape, or form. But universal design and accessibility is a passion of mine. And I have a background in education and universal design and education when it comes to curriculum and the technology. So I've moved into the universal design for physical spaces and how we design them. A critical thing to understand is that universal design is not ADA compliance. And it's something that I've come up and heard repeatedly, that if we are ADA compliant, that's where we need to be. And really, compliance is the floor. That is legally the minimum we have to do. And in all of my interactions with folks. I've never met anyone who wants to produce like the minimum level of design, right? So we need to get that out of our heads that ADA compliance is the goal. That is not the goal. Universal design is the goal. One thing that is I wanted to note with universal design is that while we do have a population that might be have legally required accessibility needs, there's a huge population that doesn't quite meet a disability diagnosis that benefits from universal design. So Lisa was talking about her hearing. She might not be have the official disability diagnosis, but she still struggles with it. So there's a huge swath of population that benefits from universal design that wouldn't maybe necessarily make themselves known everywhere in the world. So as it says here, so compliance tends to be reactive. We find out about it after the fact, and then we make a modification to the environment instead of the proactive. Let's try and think about how we can reduce barriers and ease it in the design process in the before we build the space. Again, universal design is optimized for inclusion. I feel like everyone has heard about, but I always repeat it because it's the best possible example is cut curbs that are cut down for people in wheelchairs, benefit people who have limited mobility, benefit families who have strollers, benefit dogs with very tiny legs. I don't know. So that optimization of how can we reduce these barriers to include more people. Compliance does tend to be individual accommodation instead of thinking about, there are modifications we make that will influence the environment in ways we can't anticipate. So trying to create an environment that works for everyone. And then having that, instead of having it a legal requirement, talking about things like how does this affect the experience of space? This is how we tend to talk about our spaces, and we're very lucky that we have a group that comes together and says how is your expertise in your area influencing the experience of the space, and how can we combine all of our different areas of expertise in improving the experience of the space for all users.
Yeah, and I
Awesome.
think
Thank you. Oh, sorry.
I think Rebecca made a great point about the role of compliance in universal design. Like, of course, these are the best choices that people made at a certain point. But I think that, with compliance being a one-on-one request-based thing, I think it's also really important that you're tracking what you have been doing for those people and asking yourself the question, like, if we're making this accommodation over and over again, or, what can we do to make sure that the next time that we're setting up a new space, or even going back to all of our existing spaces, that we don't have to be making this accommodation one-on-one. We can take that and like figure out how to try to meet that in more of our spaces.
Absolutely. And I want to echo that by also pointing out the ADA was passed in the early 90s. And the world has changed dramatically. Our understanding of disability has changed dramatically. And as a result, we don't have the same global space that we had then in terms of what people need or how we can provide it.
And to sort of enforce that, I like this little question here. Are we meeting the receiver counts for our assistive listening, or are we actually ensuring intelligibility? I don't know if you've ever put one of those headphones on from some of those IR-based systems, but that's not the greatest sounding thing in the world by any means. But we do today just worry about receiver counts, and we don't necessarily worry about any of the other issues related to that. We do a good job of trying to. Don't get me wrong. But I think there's a lot of room for improvement. And of course, technology is going to change that down the road as we go.
I hate to say this because I used to argue this unendingly, but the phrase that I was always told was, we just have to meet the minimum threshold in order to not get sued. And that is the prevailing mindset, at least at the institutions I've worked at. We need to hit that minimum threshold so we don't get sued. And that's not universal, that's risk management.
Yep. as we talk a little bit more about flex space, because I want to sort of keep this going back and forth between flex space so that when we get to the end of the day, we can, or the end of the hour, I think, we can tie this up with what I think is going to be a great solution. Lisa, talk a little bit about that whole data model in flex space and then how flex space might lead us down the path to better universal design in general.
John and I got into a conversation earlier about the amount of money that could be saved through standardization just within our own SUNY system. But the challenge to that is often governance, shared governance, and I think there's a reluctance of senior leadership to feel as if they're forcing solutions on people, to get back to Josh's point about, what do we need to do to meet the legal requirements. And in terms of FlexSpace as a global repository, we spent tons and tons of time. Many of you on this call, I'm sure, were part of those discussions. How do we make sure we're selecting the right room attributes to highlight, and how do you make it easy for people to upload a space and check boxes rather than having to think through their own explanation to things? So it's trying to find that balance point, again, like we were talking about this morning, of how do you make a system like FlexSpace easy to use, but also provide the data that our leadership needs, particularly when we're all a little bit competitive institutionally as well. We all like high rankings. So there was just a ton of time spent talking with people in different organizations, AVIXA, EDUCAUSE, with faculty from around the world, but certainly around the country, to say, what is it we really need to have in this system that makes it, as my friend Jerry Hanley always says, a gift rather than a burden. We want to make sure we're giving a gift.
Thank you, Lisa. And then I think this really gets where FlexSpace fits, right? Where you talk about that cross-institutional insight, where we as peers here can start to really benchmark all of the things we do, even if we're not all using the same equipment. Perhaps we can start to realize those areas where our technology, where our learning space design has a good benchmark for those things. Josh, do you have any thoughts on that and how FlexSpace can help with that sort of thing?
So unfortunately, because of where I am, I'm in Boston. We have 50 some odd colleges in the city alone, and they loathe to share information between each other because we are fighting for a finite resource base. At least within the SUNY system, you're all one system nominally. In Boston, yeah, we might have multiple campuses for one school, but it's still, every school for itself in terms of determining who goes, who talks to who and who knows what. So unfortunately, that model of information sharing is informal at best, and slam click door in your face at worst, which is weird because we all like to show off what we do, but these schools just don't like to do it. That being said, I think that having a repository of how spaces are doing it, how schools have benchmarked it, and being able to say, hey, look, this has been tested by XYZ school. It shows that it can be done without legal risk. I think that is an absolutely key thing, because schools at their core, especially nowadays, but for a very long time, have been risk averse and very risk management forward. And so if we're going to do that, or we're going to be thinking from that perspective, we need to be thinking, how do we prove that this isn't a risk for us before we make that investment?
Oh, Rebecca's got her hand up. Go ahead.
Mm-hmm. That exactly what you said, Josh, about the difference between competition versus supporting, is critical. That, like, one of the things as like the flagship institution is that we have the resources to do research, to gather data, to push for innovation. But if we're not sharing that out to schools that have fewer resources that can't do that, um, I don't know if we're being the best stewards, at least
Mhm.
in the SUNY system, but also larger. I think I personally feel a responsibility, even in my unit, to share information to other units at the school, but then also to my colleagues at other institutions that don't have the resources, time, and capability to do that. And that's critical because while we're supporting the learners at our institution, we're really supporting the learners in our country and in the world, right? So I love that FlexSpace certainly helped me when I was starting this, and there are wonderful opportunities to continue to share information with our colleagues.
Real quick, Lisa, just I want to get one thing in here and then you get to go. But I do want to say, of course, this panel, when I proposed, I guess, this idea, my ideation here is that I'm going to want everyone that is listening in right now to contribute to the conversation as we go through this next roughly hour about flex space and about universal design and what you're going to want to see there. Because, getting flex space running well, getting it operating well for what we want it to be is very important. And so, we're going to use these data points we're getting today to get some of that information. I think I was going to tee this to Lisa right now, but you had a question first.
I was just going to make a point about how what Josh said about competition and not wanting to share was one of the things that FlexSpace strove to do in the beginning is highlight rooms. Just have a small group of people say, "Ooh, that's a really cool space," and highlight it on the portal so you could take pride in that, which also tends to be an incentive for people to upload the spaces. And I think one of the key moves that HETMA made right off the bat was in the early days, it cost a lot to build the website and keep it open to everyone. So we pretty much told our vendor partners that they had to sponsor us in order to put up their own spaces. And I look at groups like, Herman Miller helped get us off the ground, Computer Comforts, and people that just, if they could have uploaded spaces, easily without necessarily sponsoring, and now through HETMA, you can do that. So the vendors and partners have an opportunity to show off spaces when they photograph outcomes.
What I didn't put here, and I was going to make an office joke, I'm aging myself now, the office show, of course, and talk about, I think it was Dunder Mifflin 2.0. But FlexSpace has already had a 2.0, right, Lisa?
Yes.
So now we're probably talking about FlexSpace 4.0, right? And so
Yeah.
I can't do Ryan as well as others can. But right now, if you go into FlexSpace, you will see what we capture today. And it's a lot of the typical stuff. There are some accessibility features in there, but I don't think they rise to the level of what we should capture more of. And that are the things that we're talking about. Sensory load, wayfinding, all of that other very important information, even capture capability. A colleague who couldn't join us today, I asked her, Beth Fellendorf, what her thoughts were about, we were capturing content years and years ago, and that was for the purpose of reinforcing what was being taught in the classroom, and the students were physically in the classroom. To a degree, there were some remote students. COVID taught us an awful lot about, well, now we're really moved on past that. And now we're moved on even past what we were doing in COVID, at least here at the University of Buffalo. We're capturing for accessibility. We're capturing for students that, don't want to identify necessarily an issue that they have. So we're just doing these captures as a matter of course now. And I think that's an important thing. We're more about serving learners than ever before. And it's not just a stack of equipment, so to speak. I don't want to I don't want to miss out on Josh's input on these things. Adam, I wonder if you could sort of start going into these design tensions. I know you face a lot of these design tensions because you're charged to go sort of ideate the space that the SUNY construction fund is building, or it's a major project or that sort of thing from the technology perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we're very lucky, and here we have a really great involvement with our facilities group, with our project facilities group especially, and so we get in fairly early or very early on construction projects. Like we have, us as an AV and IT group as part of drawing review when we're bringing on new spaces, and so we get to have these conversations early at the infrastructure stage to talk about these tensions that that we're dealing with all the time. And of course you can't win them all, because there are these real things that run directly against each other. I think that, density versus accessibility is one that we all deal with. I know poor Rebecca is always dealing with, she has the charge that we need a lot more rooms that can hold, 30 to 50 people. And we need to get 30 to 50 bodies in that room by hook or by crook. And like, it just has to happen. And of course, we all know how that can sort of run contrary to what we have going on in accessibility. And that means that you end up with the seats where people have to self-identify, or people have to say, this is the seat that I have to go into because this is the seat that has the table that I can sit into. I think I have a picture on the next slide of an example of, roughly similarly sized rooms. They're not exactly the same size, but just the kind of difference that you have when you're dealing with a room. Over on the left, we have what is a lecture hall that we did on our South Campus that, I think it holds maybe in the mid hundreds of people, I think 130 something people. And you have your 4 quote unquote accessible seats in there, and they have to self-identify, versus the other side of the token where you have a space that is roughly similarly sized. I think that space is slightly smaller, but in a similar footprint, you have the opportunity to put somebody in a chair no matter where they want to sit, no matter what cohort they're with. There's some other complicating factors with that. This enters into some of the other things about like inclusivity and cost, which is that like it is great. We real love about that room that you get to identify, you get to sit where you want, you get to group with who you want to group with for all of that. But of course, the cost is that is a room that seats under 100 now in a similarly sized room. Certainly because, now we're talking about flexible seating and flexible facings in a room. You're talking, we have 4 displays in that room, and we have to make sure that we have audio coverage that can handle all of those kinds of things. And you also have that, that barrier to the modality that the instructor likes to teach in. I know that the first time we made a room like this that we consider, a really accessible space, the first feedback that we got in that room is, how do I teach in a cafeteria? And so I think that you run into that kind of problem where you're like, yes, sometimes when you break into something that is designed from the floor up to be more inclusive, it breaks the modality of instruction. And so it's a space where you have to talk a little bit more about like, what does lecturing look like in this space? Is this the right space for lecturing even, entering into those kinds of things. I'm trying to think about what else we had. The other things are, standardization versus customization. I know that John had that on the last slide. I am, as the guy who's here to push our standard in a lot of rooms, I think that something that is important to talk about is that like standardization can be part of your accessibility approach. So if you're well standardized, then it becomes much faster to roll out an accommodation for a lot of people more quickly when you get that feedback. Oh yeah, I had this other little story about the density. So this is a project we're in the middle of right now, where these rooms are being added to our central inventory as we speak, where they said, I think this is a space where, they had to get more than 30 people in these rooms. Like that is the size of their classes for the group that is going into this space. This has to have this many people. And we just found out that it obviously, so in the first picture, that was a non-negotiable. Had to be able to get the 31, 32 seats. I forget exactly how many we have in here. You could count chairs if you want to. But then when you are putting this into the space, we said, we and a lot of other people looked at this space and said, how do you get around this place? Like, yes, I think there's a T in there. I think there is a wheelchair rotation T somewhere in the space that you can get in and out of. But what we ended up doing, that density impacts things beyond the pure accessibility standpoint, the pure compliance standpoint, where you enter, what are sightlines going to look like in this space now that you have this thing, So what we ended up doing is, you have to make that compromise. We ended up pushing the instructor station all the way to the side so that we're not, if you have to have your students that close on the wall, you have to make sure that you're getting the instructor out of the way of them for them to be able to access that content for them. You have to make sure that you are, you're then in a situation where, because they're so close, you have a nearest viewer problem instead of a farthest viewer problem. And so it involves, adding extra display and adding extra voice reinforcement to account for, what is a relatively wide room. And that's all just enters into the density part of it, the realities of, you have this job and there are things that you have to do on this job, in order for this space to be worth it for the group going in there. And then you have to, figure out what compromises you need to make.
I wanted to see if Josh could provide a little insight from his perspective here, and then I was going to tee it back to Rebecca, because she's the one still that's got to deal with the registrar and fill in the room and all that stuff too, right? So, and then we're going to go quickly and talk about procurement and where do we go from here?
So yeah, and actually I think, this should pivot easily or very well to Rebecca, because this is something that has been a literal thorn in my side for a long time. Well, literal, but the issue of, meeting what the registrar needs, which is, after the end of the day, that is our main client, is the registrar, the students, and the faculty, because we're there to support them and to, without that, what the registrar drives to the university and what they set up, we don't have jobs. Just to put it simply, we're there to support education. That being said, and I know this is a particular problem in the Boston area, I don't know if this affects a lot of other schools, when you're retrofitting buildings that maybe weren't built to be a classroom building, and you're knocking through 7 or 8 offices to create a long, narrow classroom, or you're taking an old factory like where my office used to be, and it was big, wide open floors, and they're trying to put as many classrooms in there as they can, you're going to lose that ability to be designing it easily. Theoretically, it should be easier to make it accessible, because, is what I'm trying to say, because you're starting from a blank canvas. However, the spaces that you're dealing with, the constraints that you're dealing with, and the fact that you're going to have a lot of people from the administrative sector of the school saying to you, hey, we need you to be able to cram an extra 5 students in here in order to make this class, or this room financially usable, or we want this to be a multi-purpose space. So it needs to be able to be something that can be used for events for 200, in addition to a classroom that seats, 100. Don't ask me how that math works, but I've seen that request. Or, and this is one, I think, that was what I originally wanted to go to, was when it comes to lecture capture, is that a lot of faculty, in my experience, still are nervous about it. And it's not that the students don't want it, it's that the faculty don't want their pre-published research, or they don't want something that they say that could be leaked to the media, or they don't want something that they say to be misconstrued, or they don't want, and this is a thing that we dealt with when I worked at Harvard, students who perhaps have a reason why they don't want to be heard or recorded on camera, which is another issue you have to concern yourself with. Either a student who maybe comes from a background where there's domestic violence, or who, is trying to avoid a stalker on campus, or who, for whatever reason doesn't want to be on camera. We actually had areas in the room that we notched out, and we said, this block of seats is not going to be picked up by mics, not going to be on camera. Great. But when you try to import that to a pre-existing space, as you're modifying it, you might not have that option. You might not have the option to say, okay, we want to have clear lanes for people with mobility needs, because either it's a room that was already, tiered, or because it's a room that, you have to cram extra seats into, whatever. So while we're working, we do really need this to be accessible and universally designed. The constraints that we work with from our outside partners, as I like to call them, often mean that we can't make it as universal as we would like.
Rebecca, how does that how does that from the registrar's perspective work in what we're dealing with here? And I'm gonna sort of take us off this slide now and tee up the next one, but while I'm doing that, go ahead.
Yes. So for that particular project, that was not registrar driven. First things first. We have registrar and centrally owned classrooms, but we actually have many more departmentally owned classrooms. And departments can kind of dictate a lot of their needs and design for their spaces. Now we're shifting over to a different model of investment and ownership where there are centrally owned, there are fully departmentally owned, but also now there are centrally stewarded. So in this particular case, it was we will own and maintain the classrooms, but they will retain full scheduling and any additional or extraneous outside the standard technology or anything they put in, they have to maintain. But they have a lot more say in the design of the space. So we got to that number. They were sort of insisting that they needed to have that. One of the absolutely amazing things about my unit being located in the registrar's office is that we can leverage utilization and data. So we often will walk into a meeting with a department and they say, we want a 70-person space. And we could say, you have never had a class that actually has seated 70 people. So we can help to manage the expectations of like, and leverage that. So saying we have a standard square footage per student of this much space and they push back and say we need this many people. And I can actually pull that number and say, well, you haven't registered. So unless there are major plans to your curriculum and enrollment, you actually maybe don't. And we need to, so I can push back in that way to ensure that we're adhering to better standards. It is really frustrating. If you'll notice in that slide, in fact, that 2 seats are just sitting against a wall and not at a workspace. Okay.
I think that's just an error in their defense.
It actually isn't. That is intentional for the seat count because they said they have GAs and they often have people come and visit. So they need the seating capacity to be a certain number. And our compromise was that your enrollment capacity is going to be lower than your seating capacity. We all know how this is going to work out. Look, we all know how this is going to work out. But it is really difficult retrofitting. I mean, we have entire buildings where the square footage is quite low and well below our standards, but we can't make those changes because we would lose, if we swapped them, if we updated all of our spaces, we lose a third of our seating capacity, which obviously we can't do. So it's a real tough dance between what we need, what we would like, and then what the experience of the student is. And it's lucky that we're moving more into focusing on the experience of the student over simply how many seats we can get into the space. And we're trying to get really creative. A big thing is pushing utilization. So we did utilization analysis for seat capacity and then like how these departmental spaces are used in an effort to get departments to use their spaces better. And if they are, not using them well, then maybe we move over to a central stewardship so that we can start to utilize that spaces better. We don't have to cram so many people into our central spaces. Excuse me.
Rebecca, you brought up a good point there when you talked about data and analytics. And I think one of the goals for FlexSpace is going to be that we are able to get more data and analytics out of it for when people in your position, for example, are making that argument to leadership and you need to bring data and analytics to them specifically around these issues, that we can say, hey, here are some examples of other schools, of other peers. We at UB like to talk about the top 25 all the time and how we're going to become one of them. So we're heavily focused on that. And I think that helps others as well. Sorry if I'm looking up, but my camera's here and y'all are up there. So I'm just going to keep doing this thing where I'm looking in the wrong direction. Really quick, I think talking about, and I'm going to tee this back to Adam, but I want to make sure everyone on the panel gets to say what they want to say today. So feel free to just sort of interject or raise your hand, and I'll call on you. And that goes for everyone out there as well, because I really want to make this turn this. We've got about 45 minutes left. Rebecca's got a hard stop at 1, so I want to make sure we get everything covered here. And we only have a few more slides to go, so we might be in a good spot. Josh, did you have something?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out one other thing, and that this is a constraint that may perhaps be unique to one particular institution I worked at, or it may be something that other people are encountering as well, that when you have a building which is quote unquote historic, you run into even more issues because, first of all, don't even get me started on a horsehair lathe in the walls and trying to run cables. But a lot of times you'll find that they're grandfathered in, so they don't have to meet the ADA until they make a structural adjustment to the building. We had one building when I worked at Harvard where they literally put off retrofitting anything or updating anything so they didn't have to build an elevator. And that meant that when there was an event in the basement, we were carrying road cases down a back staircase because there was no elevator access to the basement. It has to be because they have, the lawyers that are all developed there. But that loophole, I think, is something that applies particularly to older cities, but probably at other schools too.
Thank you. I'm going to we talked a little bit about this. I think design inclusion should always be before we begin buying the equipment. Too often we buy the equipment and then figure out how we're going to cram it all in there and make it inclusive and make it do everything it does. So Adam, as we talk about acoustic performance, right, RT60 targets and all of that and measuring the impact, what can you tell us about that when it comes to acoustical performance and some of the things we run up against? And one of the things we ran up against here, of course.
Yeah, of course. And of course, it's acoustics is a massive field at which everybody does a lot of really hard work and then makes a guess at the end. Because it's there's only so far you can simulate things. You try your best and then you figure it out. So I know that at our campus, we're particularly talking about, the universal inclusion of people by working on the acoustics of our space, figuring out what works best. And what's sort of ended up is that we've run a handful of pilots of, various specifically ceiling systems is where it tends to focus. I think it's because, it's easier to do something with a ceiling than it is to, change the angle of all your walls and everything. And so this is a good example of a space where, there was a perception, we were working on that larger small spaces. So we have our arbitrary line for where we start adding wireless microphones, which is at about 50 people. It wiggles a little bit depending on if you have a room that's big for 50 or small for 50 or whatever. But that's largely where our line is. And so there we had this problem where we were in one of these rooms where we're like in the upper 40s. It's far away. We're not so sure that we want to be talking about adding in wireless microphones in these spaces because, how are we going to get the batteries over there and all that kind of stuff. And we ended up getting the suggestion of putting some kind of treatment in the front of the room to add extra reverberation in the space, make the room a little bit louder. And that's great. As an AV guy, of course, I hear that and I panic because I hate putting a ceiling below another ceiling because it means it's going to be a whole thing for running cables and everything. But then, but what we did and what I'm pretty proud of is that we pumped the brakes a little bit on ourselves. And we said, well, we're doing 2 rooms that are nearly identical. Let's test it in one room and then we can bring on a consultant and measure the difference in the space, because the punchline is that we did all of this work and in one space we put in this cloud to add extra, to hopefully beef up the voice in the room. And you have to measure it after the fact because we got the results of the study back and it knocked a room that performed well with a flat ceiling, and we added that extra thing in to hopefully make the room sound much better. And our one number STI values kind of plummeted. And that's one of the things about, sort of checking your work and, we have all of the best intentions and we're all trying our best. but it came back to us, and we found that solution. And we had to come back and say, well, okay, well, maybe this isn't the solution that's going to work best for us. And I think that testing a lot of that stuff is really important, not to just say, well, we have this consideration, we want to work on it, and then and I of course understand, we don't all have the money to hire an acoustician every single time we do a new room and say, what worked, what didn't work. But if you're going to talk about something that's maybe going to enter into your central standard, your standard for most of the rooms, as this was something that we were talking about, is making sure that you take the time and measure, and that you're measuring on the other side of that, or at least collecting, qualitative experience data from your users.
Thank you, Adam. I do want to, I'm just going to show these. There's a great conversation going on in the chat right now about cables and cable connections and power and all that sort of thing. And I was going to give a quick shout out. I don't think I read it yet, but one of the things I like that Rebecca has done in a lot of the design in classrooms is sort of put in a shelf, wainscoting with a shelf, and then you can set, and I'll let you take it from there.
I was like typing as you were writing. So
this
is a really...
This will be the thing you can go out on today, since you've got that 1 o'clock hard stop.
Yeah, unfortunately, I have a 1. Although feel free, anyone who wants to reach out and talk to me, I will talk about this forever. Is a narrow shelf alongside, like on the walls, so that when students, we put in a lot of power alongside the walls, because we don't put cabled tables and movable furniture. You either have fixed furniture or you have power in the furniture. You don't have either. But what we're finding is that students sitting on they put their material or their laptops and things on the floor. That's not nice and creates tripping hazards. So we put like a 3-inch shelf that runs alongside those powered walls. We are looking into inserting also wireless chargers on the top of those shelves also. And there you go. You plug in your phone. It's also great. You can set a cup of coffee there. We no longer need to put trays for markers for whiteboards, because that shelf just exists where the markers are. It's super easy to wipe off. You don't have people walking into marker boards. It was a really simple concept that solved a lot of tiny problems and just makes the whole space a lot more accessible and like, oh, hey, put my phone here. I don't have to put it on the floor.
So there you have it. So yes, so Rebecca's new in HETMA community today. You can reach out to her there. I'm hoping she will go join the FlexSpace advisory along with all the other ones that are in there, and help us ideate FlexSpace 4.0. See how I did the Ryan Howard thing there? I think I did anyway. There's Office fans in here, I know, that can correct me on that, please. So obviously these are some practical design moves that we can be thinking about. I'm going to just be wary of time and maybe give you a little more time for lunch. Obviously, there are other things we can be doing. One of them, confidence monitors, I think, will become more popular as we sort of grow out of that COVID world from where we have, and Lisa, you should talk about Davis 101 right now, because those confidence monitors I hear are a thing they love. And the reason they like them is a universal design that we're going to be seeing more of.
Very simply, what John's describing is a large lecture hall. It's in FlexSpace. You can take a look, and I think we updated it when we put the confidence monitors in, but just 2 very large flat screens in the back of the room. So people can see what's going on, with the connected sites and whatnot. And we have them in the front of the room too, so students know when they're on camera. They know when they're interacting with their peers off-site.
I'm going to go back to Josh and ask if he wants to talk about anything in this realm here.
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest things, well, there's 2 really big things. Number one, I think you're right when you said that conference monitors are going to be a thing that we're going to start seeing more and more of. Faculty are learning more as they go, and as they're getting more used to digital, that their laptop screen is not big enough. Let's just be perfectly blunt. It's not big enough for anybody who's trying to present. It also makes you have to keep looking down. So I think the more conference monitors we can start sliding into the rooms, the better. And I think that that's something that does increase that accessibility for our faculty, because going back to that issue of aging and the fact that our bodies are, to the way I like to describe it, a slowly decaying pile of meat, we are going to eventually everybody's going to need to be able to see something bigger, and having a screen at the back that shows kind of where they are is not a bad thing. The fact that we started putting them in during COVID for hybrid, so people could see the people that were remote, is kind of the side loading we had to do for that. And then the other thing, two issues on here that I see that are incredibly accessibility issues are, first of all, the touch interface readability. Because when you've got, ideally it should be one big red button that does everything. But that's impossible because we keep adding new things in. So the buttons should be, the colors and contrast should be easily readable. The text should be something that you can actually read. It shouldn't be some little tiny, touch here to make everything work. And it should be the stuff, and it's not just about the text. It should also be that the buttons are obvious what they do. So the more we can use a universal graphic language for that, the better. And then just finally, the multiple content display zones. Going back to the same reason the conference monitors are important, there should be multiple places that a student can look at the screen and know what's there. And the reason for that, of course, being not everybody has perfect eyesight. Not everybody knows how to make a PowerPoint that's easily readable at a distance. And then that can also be, as we're moving towards these more flexible spaces in general, allow for flipped classroom uses, allow for collaborative work, et cetera, by having multiple displays throughout the room. You increase the ways that the room can be used, but also increase the accessibility. So it gives you a sale point to the administration, and then also a way to, increase accessibility as well.
Yeah,
Thank
and I
you.
know that, and so much of what you were just talking about, sort of goes around to, beating around the bush of, at least a reality for us at UB is that likely our most requested and our most granted accessibility technology accessibility thing is just course capture. Just it is such a good tool for so many different abilities and needs. There are people, if you have vision problems, you get your slides nice and big, and you can look at them later. If you have hearing problems, auditory processing issues, you can go back, get captions, listen to it again. If your English is a second language, there's so many things that you have an opportunity, to make. And so many of these things that we have on here are these sort of, crypto, these are we're making conferencing and we're making capture better in these spaces because there are so many reasons that and it's a tool that can help with so many of them, that really prioritizing that experience, even if we're post-COVID in certain ways, and we're coming back and we're being told that we're a place-based institution of higher learning. Place-based is of emphasis, but that conferencing and that capture is still really, really important in terms of like a thing that can help a lot of people with a lot of issues.
The other thing is too, we're almost everybody in this room was hit by that winter storm to some degree at the beginning of the month. Not every student's going to be able to make it to class. And so having the ability for them to see the recording, to not lose out on what is at the end of the day a very expensive product that they're buying, if nothing else, is a great advantage. And that's how we can sell it, even though it's something that really does work for accessibility if somebody isn't necessarily accessibility minded.
Thank you. I am going to see if we can open this up to everyone. We've been doing good here. We've had about 81 participants through this whole thing, and Rebecca just had to leave, so we lost one. But this is an exciting conversation that I want to hear. I want to sort of use this discussion topic right now. And we can either open it up in the chat. I don't know if it's possible to have people just raise their hand and speak, or if that's not going to work that way. I will manage the chat otherwise. But some questions that I've thrown up here, and of course the one I'm most interested is, where should FlexSpace evolve next as it comes to 4.0, but otherwise, any one of these questions, and where does universal design, I think, show up in most of your projects today, or does it? What are the trade-offs? I think we've heard a lot of these trade-offs. Adam talked a lot about the trade-offs with acoustics, with density and space, and Rebecca talked about fitting all those students in. So I'm going to look in the chat here, but all Joe's talking about is how terribly cold it got in LA, down to 78 degrees. Boo, minus 25 here last week. So cry, cry, cry. Discus. Thank you, Mike. Can we do, I don't know, can we open this up to everyone? Like if somebody wants to raise their hand and just ask a question, or am I limited to the chat? I don't know.
It's a Zoom meeting, so anyone can unmute and talk, and if they want to come on, I can spotlight someone up too.
Awesome. That would be great if anyone wants to tackle one of these discussion points. Otherwise, we can skip to I don't have many slides left. So, and actually this was only supposed to be an hour.
And I'd love to hear ideas about how to take this to the next step with your last box. I mean, how do we get people together to say we need to see this?
It's Steve Borrow here. One of the places that universal design showed up in my projects was with height adjustable teaching stations. We think about a height adjustable teaching station benefiting mainly people that have mobility challenges, and they're using a mobility aid, so they don't really stand to lecture. But it also benefits regular people based on their height. I have a friend teaching chemistry who's 6'7", and we have other faculty who are 5' nothing. And so that height adjustable teaching station puts that work surface at the right height for all those folks.
That's a great one. And that's one we encountered here at UB as well, is, we were always struggling trying to figure out how to make the teaching station accessible just under the ADA requirements. And I actually think it was our provost, who is very tall, said, I hate bending over this thing all the time. And we realized, we can start to accommodate more if we make this simple change. And so we solved a lot of those issues.
That's how exactly we solved ours as well. It's the same way, like, hey, not necessarily for wheelchair access, but like, if you're super short and you can barely see over the monitor to teach, are we really effective that way?
Mm-hmm.
We started allowing faculty to order adjustable height add-ons for their desks, like standing desks. It became really hard to justify not allowing the purchase of adjustable height podiums, because then it became clear that people actually liked having things to go up and down.
So I'm going to skip ahead because I think we've kind of covered a lot of these slides already. And I'm going to go straight to this panel question here, and I'll ask it of the panel first. If you could, think about one universal design metric that we should add to FlexSpace tomorrow, what is that?
I'd start with Josh.
Oh yeah, sure. Throw me under the bus. No, I think the number one thing that I would say is, are we built, is the room equipped for captioning? And I know something we haven't really discussed, but here's the thing. By installing auto captioning systems, by installing systems that allow people to look on their phone or their personal device and see a caption perhaps translated, that's something that is especially missing in classrooms. I've had classrooms that back up against a railroad track. I've had classrooms that run, we have the MBTA in Boston that runs on the surface right down the middle of the street, in the middle of the campus. And you've got that combined with the horns, combined with Red Sox fans. And as a result, you end up with this cacophony coming through buildings that weren't designed for sound isolation. And so if nothing else, because you can't keep pushing the audio up and up, And because it does benefit people who have an audio processing or audio disability, that's something where that I think, if we were including that, it might start nudging people to put that in.
Oh, these are some great comments we're getting in the chat too. I'm going to make sure we capture all of that. I don't know how to answer Mike's question, but that would certainly be a good metric to put in here. The new DOJ rules requiring 99% accurate captioning, which, that starts with the acoustics, that goes to the microphones, that goes to the system that's doing the capturing. So yes, all of these things we're talking about today, right? Definitely some issues to figure out and then add to flex space.
It sounds so basic, but when I've been teaching, I have this bad habit of walking around. So if you don't have a wireless mic on your instructor and it's a fixed, table mic, so much for captioning for those of us who wander.
I mean, my hope is that AI is able to help us figure out what it can and cannot hear, and it can compare to what it, compare to what it thinks it should hear. And maybe that becomes a better way of captioning. Could also tell us some things we don't want to hear. Boy, it feels like we could probably keep going with this discussion. We're nearing the end, and actually we're over. But again, I'll open it up to the entire room, all 75. So we did lose 6 people now, probably had to go to lunch. Throw out your questions. I've got this, contribute to flex space. And I think about it more from an inclusivity perspective and an accessibility and how accessible or adaptable your spaces can be. Flex space is going to give us that platform. There was a question in the chat, how do we convince leadership? And Lisa had the answer. And this is the answer she's been drilling into my head for the last 15 years or so about this. Use flex space. Show that to the provost and the president. Travis, you wanted to speak.
Yeah, is live captioning becoming the requirement for most people, or is captioning to recorded content what most people are leaning into? Just out of curiosity.
So I can say for us at UB, so we do offer, we do offer captioning on everything that we have recorded. It's just part of the feature set. We also are required to provide live person capturing, like an actual person on the other side. So we contract with a service that then our students can use, and it's a whole process involving. It's one of those things that I wish we had been able to talk to them a little bit sooner when they brought that service on, because it involves essentially opening up a Zoom meeting, and then they have a live captioner who is available there, who can then you have a live person who can then be much more likely to hit your 99% or better on your captioning performance and be able to bring that in, especially once you're into specialized industry terms or, the kinds of things that are a little bit trickier for that. So we do offer both, but we kind of offer them, they're more or less through the same method. And I think that's something else that works for us is, making sure that, to get that next level captioning, you're still using the method that you would use for automated captioning. It's hopefully just as easy as turning on captioning on the PowerPoint that they have in the front of the room.
As an additional follow-up to that, I was wondering, there's obviously a heavy focus on students because, I guess when it comes down to it, they're driving, money with butts and seats. But, I am part of the research arm of University of Washington, and I deal with a lot of spaces that are still departmental. It's all in support of training students in a medical college, stuff like that, and research. But it's dealt a little bit differently. Does anybody find that providing these flex space ideas are also equally applicable or equally accepted as ideas that should be used for all spaces, not just student spaces?
I think so. I'm biased.
I guess maybe the question would be, are you finding any pushback when it's not dealing specifically with students?
I know people
Not-
have used it to
not
look
in
at
my
conference
experience.
rooms.
Well, that's good to hear.
Conference rooms, video conference facilities, that kind of thing. I know people have gone in and looked at those when they were building them. So I don't think it's always necessarily student spaces.
We're right now starting a discussion about a space that's called the Center for Tomorrow. It's actually the Center for Yesterday because it's an absolutely awful space. And we're having this very discussion with them about what they need to be thinking about because it's used for wedding receptions and presidential events and all kinds of things on campus. But I say bulldoze it. But again, yes, leadership here at the University of Buffalo is aware that they need to be thinking about these concepts outside of the classroom, and all over the place. So that's my take on that one for sure. Before we end, I do want to say 12:30 tomorrow, right? 12:30 tomorrow, assistive listening session that you don't want to miss. I don't have the schedule in front of me, but that's my thought or what I wanted to say.
And John, I don't know if you remember this, and I don't think it's specific to UB, but our particular provost was pretty thrilled when FlexSpace was getting off the ground because he knew it would be helpful for campus decisions.
Yes, still is.
Excellent.
So that's why we've got to get it to 4.0 to keep him happy.
and all the provosts out there.
Hearing no more questions. There's a lot going on in the chat. I think this continues through lunch, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, let's keep the discussion going in the FlexSpace advisory group in hetma.org. You can go in there. You can join the advisory group and you can help shape the future of this. We're going to want it. We're going to need it. Need it right now, in fact. So, and I'm hoping we can do something cool as soon as Infocom with FlexSpace at the HETMA booth. So stay tuned. But with that, I want to thank this panel for winging it. Josh, thank you. Rock stars all around. Adam, Lisa, Rebecca, who already left, thank you. Aaron, thank you for helping me navigate all this. It's just great. So super excited to be here.
Thanks for being our fearless leader, JP.
Having me on.
So I'm
lose
out
the
now.
slides so we can see everybody again.
Right. Yeah. Thank you very much to John and the rest of the panelists. This was a wonderful session. And absolutely keep up those conversations, in the chat and during our networking lunch. And also thank you to this session was technically sponsored by SUNY by SUNY, as they are one of our sponsors, due to our partnership with FlexSpace. So super excited about that and wanted to make sure we called that out before we completely wrapped it up. But yeah, absolutely stick on by, through with us to for this networking lunch session. We absolutely understand that some people will need to step away for a little bit and do what you need to do for your regular job. But if you have the time available, keep your camera on, keep your mic on, and join us in more conversation. And I also invite everybody who's here to add your LinkedIn profile to the chat so that we can add each other and keep this networking going beyond this conference.